Okay, welcome back. So now we're going to build a slightly more detailed version of money demand, thinking about both the demand for overall money, right? Checking accounts and currency, which we call M1 in the United States, and the demand for central bank money or high-powered money, which is the reserves plus the currency. So in order to do that, we need to think about how total money demand is related to high-powered money demand. So before we had that money demand is equal to nominal GDP, nominal transactions, times this liquidity function, which is a downward sloping function in terms of the interest rate. Well, if we don't have any currency, then all of our money is going to be in checking accounts. And so we're going to make this assumption, which is a simplifying assumption, but we will relax it in the appendix, and we can see how to solve for this when some money is held as currency and some money is held in checking accounts. So we're going to assume that theta, so this is our Greek letter theta, is the reserve ratio. So this is how much of their deposits banks have to hold in reserves. And so this is going to give us our demand for high-powered money or central bank money. It's just going to be theta times MD. So our demand for high-powered money, HD, is just equal to theta times nominal GDP, $Y, times the downward sloping liquidity function there. Now, we need to have one caveat here, which is that this is in normal times when banks are lending out all of their excess reserves, which is what they should do in normal times, right? We said, remember, banks make a profit by lending out all of the reserves that they can, right? All of their excess reserves because of the interest rate spread between loans and checking accounts. Since the financial crisis, we have not been in normal times. Reserves have increased a lot, and banks have actually been sitting on excess reserves. And the Federal Reserve has actually been paying an interest rate on excess reserves, which they previously had not done. And so I think there's some question about why they instituted this, and we can talk about that later. But the fact is that we have a lot of excess reserves that could enter the market, but that hasn't entered the market. So keep that in mind while we're going through this model. All right, so now the central bank really does control the supply of central bank money, right? We kind of made the assumption that they control the supply of the total money supply, which isn't completely true because it relies on banks. But they definitely control the supply of central bank money through open market operations, through buying and selling treasury bills and other types of bonds with the banks in exchange for reserves. And so given that high-powered money supply or central bank money is equal to the demand, we can plug that into our previous equation and say that the supply of central bank money is equal to the demand, which is theta times nominal GDP times our liquidity function. So if we have an increase in central bank money, that's going to lead to a decrease in the interest rate because of our downward sloping liquidity function. And a decrease in H will lead to an increase in the interest rate. And so we can see that using our graph. This looks just like the other graph, except we've replaced M, the total money supply, with H, the central bank money supply. So there's really no difference here. The interest rate, as we said, the interest rate that is actually targeted by the central bank is the federal funds rate. And the federal funds rate is the rate at which banks lend each other reserves. So the idea here is that because there's a required reserve ratio, if at the end of the day you find yourself with not enough reserves or too much reserves, then you will either borrow or lend those reserves on the federal funds market. That is a market that the Federal Reserve observes and can see the interest rate, and so they can see whether or not they need to increase or decrease the supply of reserves based on the interest rate that they observe and the target that they have. So this federal funds rate is very important, right, because it's the main indicator of U.S. monetary policy, and is why it's very important that it's been stuck at zero for most of the time since 2008, 2009, with only a brief increase before the COVID-19 pandemic pushed it back down to zero. And so this is where we are right now, is the zero lower bound, where we can't decrease the interest rate anymore, which means that monetary policy is not that effective in increasing economic activity, right? So monetary policy works through changing the interest rates in the economy. If the interest rate that they control, or at least target, and they are effective in targeting this interest rate, is at zero and they can't push it down anymore, then monetary policy is not going to be as effective. So let's think about how we might graph that, right? So we have money demand here. We have money on the horizontal axis, the interest rate here. Eventually at a zero interest rate, which is represented, by this horizontal axis, any money demand above that isn't going to change the interest rate. So, if we start here at A, and we decrease the interest rate all the way to zero, and we're now here at B, then increasing the money supply anymore to C is not actually going to have any effect. And this is what we saw, right? We saw the money supply increase significantly, especially reserves, right, which is central bank money, but also M1 and even M2, which adds in savings accounts and certificates of deposits. And interest rates obviously didn't change anymore because, we were already at zero. So this is sort of what happened during the financial crisis. You can see the sort of purpley line here is vault cash plus reserves at the Federal Reserve Bank, so that's their reserves. The blue line is checkable deposits. We started out the financial crisis in 2007 at about $900 billion of central bank money, the monetary base it's often also called. And then by 2014, you can see checkable deposits were almost $2 trillion, and reserves were almost $2.5 trillion. And so the money supply had increased astronomically. And all these reserves, you would think the banks would have an incentive to lend them out and increase their profit, but they haven't done so. And so I think that's another question. And as I said, and I think it was in 2011 that the central bank started paying interest rate on those reserves, which means that, it's a very low interest rate, but if you have $2 trillion, even a very low interest rate will add up, right? So I think that's kind of one way that we recapitalize the banks that had gotten in trouble in the financial crisis.